The Republican primaries that just unfolded across multiple states were not ordinary elections. They were not isolated local contests. They were not random political coincidences. They were a referendum inside the Republican Party itself. And the message from the Republican base could not have been clearer. Donald Trump still owns the political energy in the modern GOP. For years now, political commentators, establishment Republicans, legacy media analysts, and anti-Trump conservatives have been repeating the same prediction over and over again. They kept saying that Trump's influence was fading. They said the movement was exhausted. They said Republican voters were ready to move on. They insisted the base was tired of confrontation, tired of populism, tired of the America First agenda. And yet, every single time Republican voters are actually given the opportunity to speak through elections, they say the exact opposite. That is what happened again in these primaries. The clearest examples came from Louisiana and Kentucky, where two high-profile Republican incumbents, Senator Bill Cassidy and Congressman Thomas Massie, became symbols of a much larger conflict inside the Republican Party. And in both cases, the Republican electorate sent a devastating message. If you campaign as part of the Trump movement, ride the energy of the Trump voter into office, and then arrive in Washington only to undermine the agenda that voters sent you there to support, eventually the base will revolt. That is exactly what happened. The case of Bill Cassidy is perhaps the easiest to understand. Cassidy was never fully trusted again after 2021, the moment he voted to convict Donald Trump during the impeachment proceedings following January 6th. It fundamentally severed his relationship with a huge portion of the Republican base in Louisiana. That vote was not viewed by Trump supporters as some noble act of conscience. They viewed it as a betrayal. And the numbers showed that the Republican electorate never moved past it. In the Louisiana Republican Senate primary, Cassidy failed even to make the runoff, finishing behind Trump-backed Congresswoman Julia Letlow and Louisiana State Treasurer John Fleming. That is politically catastrophic for an incumbent senator. Cassidy was not some unknown congressman. He was an established sitting U.S. senator with institutional backing, fundraising networks, media recognition, and years of incumbency advantage. Yet, none of that mattered once Republican voters decided he no longer represented their movement. And this is the key point that establishment Republicans continue refusing to understand. Trump supporters do not view politics transactionally anymore. They view it tribally and ideologically. They expect loyalty to the mission. That does not mean blind obedience to every single statement Trump makes, but it does mean alignment with the larger political project that Republican voters believe they voted for: border enforcement, immigration restriction, economic nationalism, anti-globalism, anti-establishment politics, and resistance to what they view as weaponized institutions. Once Cassidy positioned himself publicly against Trump during impeachment and later refused to endorse him enthusiastically, many Republican voters concluded that he was no longer fighting for their side. And in modern Republican politics, that matters more than resume lines or Senate seniority. The Republican base today is not looking for respectable managers. They are looking for fighters. But the Thomas Massie situation is even more fascinating because it reveals the deeper transformation inside the Republican coalition. Massie had built a reputation for years as an independent-minded libertarian conservative. He had a loyal online following. He was popular among anti-establishment conservatives. Many people viewed him as intellectually consistent. But consistency is not the same thing as alignment. And eventually, that distinction caught up with him. Massie repeatedly found himself opposing Trump-backed legislation and key elements of the administration's agenda. Trump openly condemned him and backed challenger Ed Gallerine in Kentucky's 4th District primary. Gallerine ultimately defeated Massie in one of the most expensive House primaries in American history. Now, the coping narrative from Massie supporters emerged almost immediately. They argued that outside money influenced the race. They argued that pro-Israel groups targeted Massie because of foreign policy disagreements. They argued that Trump supporters were being manipulated. But that explanation avoids the central issue. Massie lost because a large portion of Republican primary voters concluded that he was no longer functioning as part of the team they elected. And whether people like that reality or not, that is how modern populist political coalitions operate. The voters of Kentucky's 4th District overwhelmingly support Donald Trump. Trump is enormously popular in Kentucky. Those voters sent both Trump and Massie to Washington expecting ideological cooperation on core priorities. But when Republican voters repeatedly watched Massie oppose Trump-backed initiatives, especially on major agenda items, many of them began asking a simple question: Why are we sending Republicans to Washington if they are going to help obstruct Republican goals? That frustration accumulated over time, and eventually it exploded politically. What these primaries really demonstrate is that the Republican Party is no longer primarily an establishment conservative party. It has transformed into a populist nationalist movement centered around Donald Trump and the political culture that emerged from him. That transformation is still incomplete, which is why these internal battles keep happening. You still have two Republican parties operating under the same label. One party sees politics as procedural, institutional, and managerial. The other sees politics as existential, cultural, and confrontational. Trump voters increasingly belong to the second category. To them, politics is no longer simply about tax policy or committee assignments. It is about survival of values, national identity, institutional trust, immigration, globalization, cultural conflict, and perceived civilizational decline. That is why loyalty matters so much now. Not loyalty merely to Trump as a person, but loyalty to the broader populist revolt he represents. And politicians who underestimate that emotional connection continue learning the same lesson the hard way. Trump's political gravity is still massive. One of the most remarkable aspects of these primaries is that they once again demonstrated Trump's almost unmatched ability to shape Republican outcomes years after first entering politics. Political scientists and analysts have spent nearly a decade trying to explain this phenomenon away, but the explanation is actually straightforward. Trump did something few politicians ever achieve. He fused his personal political identity with the emotional identity of his voter base. That creates political gravity. Republican voters do not merely support Trump as a candidate. Many see attacks on Trump as attacks on themselves, their values, their frustrations, and their grievances. So, when Republican incumbents publicly oppose Trump, many voters interpret it not as principled disagreement, but as abandonment of the movement itself. And that is politically lethal in a Republican primary. The evidence is now overwhelming. Cassidy lost badly. Massie lost despite years of incumbency. Other Republicans around the country are already recalculating their positions after watching what happened. Because whether one likes it or not, Trump remains the center of gravity inside Republican politics. And the primaries just proved it again. And now, the political earthquake inside the Republican Party is expanding beyond Louisiana and Kentucky. Because what happened to Bill Cassidy and Thomas Massie is not isolated. It is part of a much larger political realignment happening in real time inside the GOP. The old Republican establishment, the managerial class, the go-along to get along wing of the party, is colliding head-on with a Republican voter base that has become fully populist, fully nationalist, and fully centered around Donald Trump and the America First movement. And nowhere is that more obvious than Texas. For years, Senator John Cornyn represented the whole Republican establishment model perfectly. Careful, institutional, procedural, safe. But that version of Republican politics increasingly feels disconnected from the emotional energy of the modern Republican base. Republican voters today are not looking for polished institutionalism. They are looking for confrontation, loyalty, aggression, alignment with Trump's agenda. And Cornyn has increasingly struggled to convince Republican voters that he belongs in that movement anymore. That is why Trump's endorsement of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton was such a political nuclear bomb. The moment Trump endorsed Paxton, the race fundamentally changed, because Republican primary voters no longer merely see Trump endorsements as symbolic gestures. They see them as movement certification. They see them as Trump telling the base who is fighting for them and who is not. And the brutal truth for Cornyn is this: many Republican voters no longer trust him to fight. That perception did not emerge overnight. It built gradually over years as Cornyn became increasingly associated with establishment Republican leadership, Senate procedural politics, compromise politics, and institutional Washington culture. Meanwhile, Paxton positioned himself as the exact opposite: aggressive, confrontational, anti-establishment, combative against Democrats, federal institutions, media organizations, and the political class itself. In modern Republican primaries, especially in deep red states like Texas, that contrast matters enormously. The establishment's response to this race has been panic. You can see it everywhere in Republican leadership circles. Senate Republicans are openly terrified that Paxton's nomination could cost them a Senate seat because of his legal controversies and ethics baggage. But here is what establishment Republicans still fail to understand. For many Trump voters, the question is no longer who is the cleanest candidate. The question is, who is willing to fight the system we hate? And in the eyes of many Republican primary voters, Cornyn increasingly looked like part of that system. That is why this race has become so symbolic. It is not merely Paxton versus Cornyn. It is MAGA populism versus institutional republicanism. And right now, institutional republicanism is losing badly. And here is why Republican voters are purging disloyalty. This is the deeper story behind all these primaries. The Republican base increasingly views politics through the lens of alignment and loyalty. Again, not merely loyalty to Trump personally, but loyalty to the political mission they believe Trump represents. And once Republican voters conclude that an incumbent is obstructing that mission, the incumbent becomes politically vulnerable no matter how long they have been in office. This is exactly what happened to Cassidy. This is exactly what happened to Massie. And this is exactly why Cornyn is now in. The old Republican model assumed voters prioritized seniority, committee influence, electability arguments, and institutional experience. The new Republican base cares far more about ideological aggression and movement solidarity. That is why the establishment keeps getting blindsided. They are playing by 2012 political rules in a 2026 Republican Party. The same dynamic exploded in Georgia. Georgia has become one of the most important political battlegrounds in America, but internally, the Republican Party there has been undergoing a civil war for years. Much of that tension revolves around Republican officials who either distanced themselves from Trump, criticized him, or refused to fully align with his claims and agenda after 2020. And Republican voters in Georgia have clearly not forgotten. The defeat of anti-Trump establishment Republicans in Georgia reflects the exact same phenomenon happening nationally. Republican primary voters are purging figures they view as disconnected from the movement base. The grassroots base no longer wants Republicans who merely wear the label Republican. They want Republicans who actively participate in the populist nationalist project that Trump built. This is why so many governors, senators, and congressmen who once thought they could survive by carefully balancing Trump and the establishment are suddenly finding themselves politically exposed, because the Republican base increasingly demands clarity. And if voters conclude that a politician chose the wrong side, incumbency no longer protects them. The Republican Party is becoming a movement party. This is the real transformation happening here. The GOP is no longer functioning like a traditional political party alone. It is increasingly functioning like a political movement centered around a shared worldview. That worldview includes hostility toward establishment institutions, distrust of legacy media, skepticism of globalization, strong nationalism, immigration restriction, anti-progressivism, anti-bureaucratic sentiment, populist economic frustration, and cultural conservatism. Trump became the vessel for those frustrations. And because it became the vessel, Republican voters increasingly interpret attacks on Trump-aligned politics as attacks on themselves. That emotional connection is what establishment Republicans continuously underestimate. They think voters are making detached procedural calculations. They are not. The modern Republican base votes emotionally, tribally, culturally, and ideologically. That is why disloyalty carries such severe consequences now, on Thomas Massie specifically and the new class of dissenters on account of Israel. There is a point that needs to be addressed directly. Some of Massie's supporters insist the race was primarily about Israel and foreign policy influence. It is true that outside spending and geopolitical disagreements became part of the race narrative. Even international outlets framed the race partly through that lens. But reducing Massie's defeat entirely to that explanation misses the broader political reality. Massie's conflict with Trump had become much bigger than one issue. The Republican base repeatedly watched Massie oppose Trump-backed initiatives at crucial moments. That accumulated over time. Besides, the Republican base watched in horror as Massie garnered support from the enemy. Different progressive media personalities and outlets pushed Massie and openly supported him. Also, a report showed that Rep. Massie allegedly received several $7,000 donations from donors with the last name Mahfouz. That records also showed that those figures also contributed to Ilhan Omar, Ro Khanna, Cory Bush, and Kit Ellison. That there is a pattern here. That 79% of Massie's donors also donated to Democrats and Act Blue, allegedly. Eventually, many Republican voters simply concluded that Massie was no longer aligned with the movement they supported. And once that perception hardens, it becomes extremely difficult to survive a Republican primary in the Trump era. That is the lesson every Republican incumbent is now learning. The Republican electorate is no longer rewarding distance from Trump. it is punishing it. Trump's dominance is now structural. What makes all this so significant is that Trump's influence is no longer merely personal charisma. It has become structural. He now has an ideological movement, a loyal voter bloc, a massive media ecosystem, a fundraising network, grassroots activists, candidate recruitment power, endorsement power, and cultural influence over the GOP base. That means Republican politicians can no longer simply wait Trump out. Many tried. Many assumed the movement would fade after 2020. Instead, the opposite happened. The movement hardened. And now, politicians who opposed Trump are finding themselves politically isolated inside their own party. Cassidy learned it. Massie learned it. Cornyn learned it too. And every Republican incumbent in America is watching closely.